Salvatore Lucania, the man who would later be remembered as Lucky Luciano, was born on November 11, 1896, in the small Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti. Nestled in the hills of central Sicily, Lercara Fritti was no glamorous birthplace. It was a poor coal mining community where families like the Lucanias lived hand to mouth, eking out survival from unforgiving land and low wages. Life in Sicily at the turn of the 20th century was hard, almost hopeless for the working poor. Poverty was widespread, opportunities were scarce, and corruption was part of the air people breathed. The strong ruled over the weak, and authority often meant little more than exploitation. For young Salvatore, these early conditions etched into him the realities of inequality, survival, and the unspoken codes of power that govern society. His father, Antonio Lucania, was a sulfur miner. His mother, Rosalia, cared for the children while struggling to stretch meager resources. The family's existence was defined by long hours of backbreaking labor, small meals, and dreams of something better beyond Sicily's shores. The Lucanias were not criminals, not mobsters, not connected to any famous Mafia clans. They were simply another poor Sicilian family among thousands who longed for a chance at dignity and opportunity. That chance seemed impossible in their homeland. But across the ocean, in the United States, stories were spreading about a land where even the poor could reinvent themselves. In 1906, when Salvatore was just 9 years old, the Lucania family joined the massive wave of Italian immigrants sailing for America. Their journey across the Atlantic was no luxury cruise. Immigrants were packed into the steerage decks of ships, sharing cramped quarters, meager food, and seasickness. Families huddled together, clutching their possessions and hopes, while the salty air and endless waves carried them toward a place they had only heard about in letters and rumors. When the Lucanias finally arrived at Ellis Island, they passed through the same immigration process as millions of others. Medical checks, paperwork, questions asked in a language they barely understood. And when they emerged into New York, they entered a new world that was as overwhelming as it was promising. The Lucania family settled on Manhattan's Lower East Side, a crowded immigrant neighborhood filled with tenements, pushcarts, sweatshops, and the voices of dozens of nationalities. To some, the Lower East Side was a beacon of diversity and resilience. To others, it was a ghetto of poverty, vice, and crime. For young Salvatore, who quickly adopted the name Charlie to fit in, the neighborhood was both a school of survival and a testing ground for ambition. Life in the tenements was harsh. Families were squeezed into small, airless apartments. Sanitation was poor, diseases spread quickly, and children grew up on the streets as much as they did at home. At school, Charlie Lucania struggled with English and was teased by other boys. His thick Sicilian accent and rough manners set him apart. But Charlie was not timid. He quickly learned to fight back, to impose himself, and to build small circles of loyalty and respect. By his early teens, he was already running with neighborhood gangs, dabbling in petty crime, and carving out a reputation for toughness. Dropping out of school around the age of 14, Luciano drifted into the street economy. He delivered hats, worked odd jobs, and spent time in the pool halls and alleys where young men traded stories, made deals, and learned the ropes of hustling. He was clever, observant, and not afraid of risk. But more than anything, he understood people. He knew how to intimidate the weak, how to charm potential allies, and how to build networks that could protect him when trouble came. One of Luciano's early hustles was running protection for Jewish kids in the neighborhood. For a nickel, he promised to shield them from bullies. If they didn't pay, he was the bully. The scheme was crude but effective. and it revealed an instinct that would define his later career. The blending of intimidation and business, the transformation of crime into enterprise. By the time he reached his late teens, Luciano had already been arrested more than once. In 1916, he served 6 months for selling heroin, hiding it in women's hats. Though the punishment was minor, it was a turning point. Drugs were still a small trade in those days, but Luciano had already seen how illicit markets operated. More importantly, he had entered the files of law enforcement, a name and face that would later become infamous. But Luciano's criminal education was not only learned on the street. He came under the influence of Arnold Rothstein, a sophisticated gambler and fixer known as the man who had allegedly orchestrated the 1919 Black Sox baseball scandal. Rothstein was no ordinary thug. He dressed impeccably, moved in high society, and treated crime as an industry. From Rothstein, Luciano learned how to think beyond fists and knives. He learned the value of corruption, how to buy politicians and police, how to blend legitimate business with underworld activity, and how to think long-term. Rothstein became both mentor and model, showing Luciano that real power came not from fear alone, but from control, strategy, and invisibility. At the same time, Luciano never lost touch with his Sicilian roots. The Italian immigrant community was tight-knit, bound by old customs of honor, loyalty, and omerta, the code of silence. These values were not merely cultural relics. They were the foundation of the Mafia. While Luciano would later modernize the Mafia, stripping it of some old-world romanticism, he understood the deep psychological power of tradition. He could navigate the Sicilian way of respect while embracing the American way of opportunity. By the end of the 1910s, Charlie, Lucky, Luciano had emerged from the rough immigrant boy into a streetwise young man with ambition far greater than the average hoodlum. He was no longer just a petty criminal. He had tasted prison, formed connections, and absorbed lessons from powerful figures. He carried the toughness of the Lower East Side, the cunning of a hustler, and the strategic vision of a future boss. Historians debate where the nickname Lucky originated. Some say it came from surviving beatings and stabbings. Others claim it was simply a shortened version of Lucania. Whatever its origin, the name fit. Luciano seemed to have an uncanny ability to survive and even thrive in dangerous situations. He was stabbed, beaten, robbed, yet each time he returned stronger, more determined. As the 1920s approached, America was entering the Prohibition era, when alcohol would be outlawed and organized crime would explode into unprecedented power and profit. For Luciano, the timing was perfect. He was young, hungry, and positioned at the crossroads of immigrant ambition and underworld opportunity. The boy from Lurcara, who had crossed an ocean in search of a better life, who had fought on the streets of New York to carve out respect, who had learned from both gangsters and gentlemen. This boy was about to become a man whose name would echo through history. The foundations were set. The early life of Salvatore Lucania had forged the personality of Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern American Mafia. The story of Lucky Luciano's youth in New York is inseparable from the story of the Lower East Side itself. In the early 20th century, the Lower East Side of Manhattan was a place unlike any other in America, a neighborhood overflowing with the energy, noise, and hardship of thousands of newly arrived immigrants. Italians, Jews, Irish, Germans, Poles, and countless others crowded into narrow tenements where families of 6 or 7 lived in 2 small rooms, sharing bathrooms with dozens of neighbors. The air was thick with the smell of cooking, sewage, coal smoke, and sweat. The streets below were filled with pushcarts, vendors shouting in broken English, children darting between wagons, and young men looking for ways to earn or steal a dollar. It was in this harsh but vibrant world that young Salvatore, Charlie Lucania, grew into adolescence. His family, like so many others, had come with dreams of opportunity, but reality was unforgiving. Antonio, his father, found only sporadic work as a laborer. The family's apartment was cramped and noisy. Money was always short. Charlie, restless and ambitious, quickly realized that if he wanted more than poverty, he would have to find his own way, and he wasn't afraid to bend rules to get it. School never interested him. He was intelligent but impatient, and his difficulty with English made him a target for mockery. By the age of 14, he dropped out. For the rest of his life, Luciano would never have more than a basic education, but he compensated with street smarts that would outmatch men with far more formal schooling. Out of the classroom, the streets became his university. Charlie joined up with local boys who formed gangs for protection, fun, and petty crime. The Lower East Side at the time was full of such gangs, small-time groups of kids who fought over turf, hustled nickels and dimes, and dreamed of becoming big players. Some gangs stole coal from delivery wagons. Others ran protection rackets on small businesses. For Charlie, one of his earliest hustles was offering Jewish kids protection from bullies. He charged them 5 or 10 cents a week. If they paid, he kept others away. If they didn't, he became the bully himself. It was crude, but it revealed a pattern that would define his life, the combination of intimidation and business, violence and profit. It was also during these years that Luciano formed some of the most important friendships of his life. On the Lower East Side, he met Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, both Jewish kids with similar ambitions and toughness. At first, they were rivals, facing off in street fights. But soon they recognized something in each other: courage, cunning, and a willingness to think bigger. Their bond would become legendary, and it was a rare example of cross-ethnic loyalty in a time when Italians and Jews often clashed. Meyer Lansky in particular impressed Luciano. Small, quiet, and calculating, Lansky had a gift for numbers and strategy. He saw crime as an organization, not just a series of street fights. Luciano, who had already absorbed the lessons of intimidation, found in Lansky a partner who could balance violence with intelligence. Together, they began to imagine a future where gangs could move beyond nickel and dime schemes into real power. But before Luciano could rise, he had to survive the brutal life of the Lower East Side. Violence was constant. Street fights broke out over territory, insults, or simple boredom. Knives and fists were the weapons of choice, but guns were slowly making their way into the mix. Luciano himself was no stranger to beatings. He was stabbed more than once, and he carried scars as reminders of the dangers of his world. Yet each time he came back, it seemed, as people began to whisper that Charlie was lucky. Whether it was fate, skill, or sheer toughness, he had a way of surviving situations that might have killed other men. During his late teens, Luciano's criminal activities grew bolder. He was arrested several times for theft, assault, and drug possession. In 1916, he was caught selling heroin, hiding it in women's hats, and spent 6 months in a reformatory. At that time, narcotics were a small but growing business, and Luciano was already experimenting with the trades that would later make him rich. His arrest did little to deter him. If anything, it gave him a taste of the risks and taught him that jail was simply part of the price of doing business. The world outside his neighborhood was changing rapidly. America was entering the 1920s, and with it came Prohibition, the nationwide ban on the sale of alcohol. Though the law had not yet taken effect, whispers of it were everywhere. To men like Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel, prohibition represented not a restriction, but the greatest opportunity of their generation. They knew that Americans would never stop drinking. If liquor was outlawed, then bootlegging, illegal production and sale, would become one of the most profitable industries in the country, and the gangs who controlled it would rise from street thugs to kings. Luciano was preparing himself for this moment. He studied the older gangsters of the neighborhood, men like Joe, the boss, Masseria, and the up and coming Sicilian mobsters who controlled rackets in Manhattan. He watched how they used violence strategically, not recklessly. He noticed how bribes to police and politicians could buy protection far more reliable than a gun. Most importantly, he learned the difference between being a soldier and being a leader. Soldiers did the dirty work. Leaders built the empire. Luciano wanted to be a leader. The years between 1910 and 1920 were his apprenticeship. They hardened him, taught him how to navigate the multi-ethnic underworld, and introduced him to the people who would become his allies. They also shaped his philosophy, that organized crime should be just that, organized. To him, crime was not about tradition, family honor, or personal vendettas, as it often was for the old world mafiosi. It was about profit. It was about efficiency. It was about creating an empire that functioned like a business. By the time he was in his early 20s, Luciano was no longer just another tough kid from the Lower East Side. He was building a reputation as someone to watch. He was known for his sharp dress, his confidence, and his willingness to work with anyone, Italian, Jewish, or Irish, if it meant making money. This open-mindedness set him apart from older mobsters who clung to ethnic divisions. Luciano was part of a new generation that saw the future in collaboration. As 1920 dawned, Prohibition officially began. Across the country, legitimate bars went dark, but underground speakeasies lit up the night. Smuggling routes were drawn across borders, bootlegging gangs began to battle for control, and the American underworld was poised for transformation. For Lucky Luciano, now in his early 20s, the stage was set. The lessons of his youth, the poverty of Sicily, the hardships of the Lower East Side, the friendships with Lansky and Siegel, the mentorship of Arnold Rothstein, the scars of street fights and jail time had all prepared him for this moment. The immigrant boy named Salvatore Lucania had survived and adapted. The young man known as Charlie had built alliances, learned the rules of corruption, and tasted the profits of crime. Now, as Prohibition loomed, he was about to become Lucky Luciano, the man who would reshape organized crime in America forever. The year 1920 was a turning point not just for Charlie Luciano, but for the entire underworld of America. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, and the Volstead Act enforced it. Alcohol was outlawed. Overnight, something as ordinary as a glass of beer or whiskey was declared illegal. Yet America's thirst did not vanish. In fact, it grew stronger. And with that thirst came one of the greatest opportunities in criminal history. For men like Luciano, who had already been hustling on the streets of New York, Prohibition was the open door to wealth, power, and influence on a scale previously unimaginable. He was still in his early 20s, but he understood instantly what this new era meant. To him, liquor was not just contraband, it was liquid gold. Whoever controlled its flow would control cities, fortunes, and lives. Luciano was already tied into the Lower East Side networks, but Prohibition forced him to think bigger. The street gangs that fought over nickels now had a chance to become organizations worth millions. This was not about petty theft anymore. It was about industrial-scale smuggling, brewing, and distribution. To succeed, Luciano needed alliances, and he knew exactly where to look. He gravitated to Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish gambler and fixer who had become his mentor. Rothstein was no brawler, he was a businessman. He taught Luciano to think of bootlegging not as a gamble, but as a business plan. Rothstein financed operations, arranged connections, and showed Luciano how to launder money through legitimate fronts. Under Rothstein's influence, Luciano began to distance himself from being just a street soldier. He started to see himself as an entrepreneur of crime. At the same time, Luciano tightened his friendships with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Lansky, with his sharp mind and talent for numbers, was the perfect strategist. Siegel, hot-headed and fearless, was the muscle. Together, they formed a trio that blended brains, brawn, and vision. They were young, ambitious, and willing to cooperate across ethnic lines. A rare move in a time when Italians, Jews, and Irish mobs usually clashed more than they cooperated. This partnership laid the foundation of a new kind of underworld. While the older generation of Sicilian bosses clung to traditions, vendettas, and codes of honor, Luciano and his friends thought in terms of profit margins and territories. They were pragmatic, not sentimental. For Luciano, there was no reason not to work with Jews or Irishmen if it meant bigger profits. Money had no ethnicity. Still, Luciano knew he had to operate within the existing Italian power structure. The Sicilian bosses controlled much of New York's Italian underworld, and without their blessing, or at least their tolerance, he couldn't expand. At this time, one of the most powerful was Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria. Masseria was a traditional Sicilian don, operating with fear, loyalty, and a taste for violence. Luciano aligned himself with Masseria, not because he admired him, but because he understood the importance of backing. Under Masseria's wing, Luciano gained access to bootlegging networks, protection, and credibility in the Italian Mafia world. But Luciano was never content to be anyone's soldier. Even while working under Masseria, he built his own side deals, especially with Lansky and Siegel. He organized shipments of liquor coming from Canada, often through the Great Lakes. He arranged for trucks to distribute alcohol across New York. He even used bribed dock workers to slip shipments past customs. Every operation taught him something: how to negotiate prices, how to buy off police, how to punish betrayal without drawing too much attention. His charm and cunning earned him respect, but he was also feared. Luciano was not above violence. If someone crossed him, he could be ruthless. Yet he was smart enough to know that excessive bloodshed was bad for business. Unlike many gangsters of the era who thrived on sheer brutality, Luciano preferred efficiency. Violence was a tool, not a passion. The early 1920s were also the years that gave him his infamous nickname, Lucky. The most famous story behind it happened in 1929, but even before then, Luciano had already developed a reputation for surviving near-death encounters. He had been stabbed in fights, beaten by rivals, and arrested multiple times, yet he always came back. Some said he was just lucky to survive. Others believed his cunning and street sense saved him. Whatever the truth, the name stuck, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. By 1923 and 1924, Luciano's name was being whispered throughout New York's underworld. He had risen from the rough streets of the Lower East Side to become a recognized figure in the bootlegging trade. He was still under the shadow of Joe Masseria, but he was carving out independence. His alliance with Lansky and Siegel gave him a power base that crossed ethnic lines, and his connection to Rothstein gave him credibility among gamblers, financiers, and corrupt politicians. Then, in 1925, Luciano took one of the boldest steps of his early career. He began reaching out to other ethnic mobs beyond New York. Through Lansky, he made connections in Chicago, where Al Capone was rising to power. Capone and Luciano were different men. Capone was flamboyant, loud, and violent, while Luciano was calculating and business-minded, but they respected each other. Luciano understood that if the underworld remained fractured, with Italians, Jews, and Irish constantly fighting, law enforcement would eventually crush them. But if they could cooperate, share territories, and divide profits, they could build a national syndicate more powerful than anyone imagined. This was the seed of an idea that would later become Luciano's greatest legacy, the National Commission. But in the mid-1920s, it was just a vision. For now, Luciano had to play the game carefully. He stayed loyal to Mafia on the surface, while quietly expanding his influence with allies. He moved liquor, ran gambling dens, invested in brothels, and used his growing fortune to bribe politicians and policemen. Every dollar he made bought him more freedom, more power, and more respect. The years 1920 to 1925 were Luciano's apprenticeship in organized crime at its highest level. He had graduated from street hustler to rising mob figure. He learned how to balance loyalty with ambition, how to navigate between old world bosses and new world gangsters, and how to turn crime into a business empire. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano was no longer just another gangster. He was a man positioning himself for greatness. He had the scars of the street, the wisdom of mentors like Rothstein, the loyalty of friends like Lansky and Siegel, and the backing of powerful bosses like Mafia. The stage was set. What remained was the coming storm of the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between rival mafia factions in New York. Luciano would not only survive that war, he would shape its outcome, betray old loyalties, and emerge as the architect of a new order. But before that, in the mid-1920s, he was still building, still learning, still waiting. The immigrant boy had become a rising gangster. The Lower East Side hustler had become a bootlegger with national ties. And in the shadows of New York, a young man named Charlie, Lucky Luciano, was preparing to seize control of the American underworld. By the mid-1920s, Charlie, Lucky Luciano was no longer just a scrappy kid hustling on the Lower East Side. He had matured into a seasoned bootlegger, a shrewd businessman, and a man with growing influence in the underworld. Yet for all his ambition, he still had to navigate the world of powerful Sicilian bosses who dominated the Italian criminal networks of New York. Chief among them was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mafia. Joe Mafia was an old-school gangster, a Sicilian don who ruled through fear and tradition. He was overweight, coarse, and prone to violence, but his power was undeniable. In the mid-1920s, Mafia controlled much of the Italian rackets in Manhattan, from gambling and extortion to bootlegging operations. He demanded loyalty, tribute, and unquestioned obedience from those under him. Luciano, recognizing that aligning with Mafia offered both protection and opportunity, attached himself to the boss. But Luciano was no ordinary subordinate. Unlike many Sicilian immigrants who clung to the old world customs of honor and vendetta, Luciano thought differently. He respected power but rejected the rigidity of tradition. For him, crime was not about ethnic pride or revenge. It was about business. This philosophy often clashed with the attitudes of men like Mafia, but Luciano was careful. Outwardly, he remained loyal. Privately, he was already imagining a different kind of future. Working under Mafia, Luciano gained access to large-scale bootlegging operations. He coordinated shipments of Canadian whiskey, ran trucks across state lines, and managed speakeasies hidden in New York's nightlife. These ventures brought enormous profits, but also enormous risks. Law enforcement was cracking down, rival gangs were battling for territory, and betrayal was always around the corner. Luciano thrived in this environment. He was calm under pressure, able to negotiate deals one moment and order retribution the next. His reputation grew not just as a tough gangster, but as a man who could think strategically. One of the defining moments of this period came in 1925, when Luciano was kidnapped by a group of unknown assailants. They beat him, stabbed him multiple times, and left him for dead on a Staten Island beach. Miraculously, he survived. His right eye drooped permanently from the injuries, and his face bore scars for the rest of his life. But instead of retreating, Luciano turned the incident into part of his legend. From then on, people said he was lucky to be alive. The nickname Lucky stuck, and it gave him an aura of resilience and inevitability. If Luciano could survive such brutality, perhaps he was destined for greatness. The mid-1920s also saw Luciano deepen his partnerships outside the Italian community. His alliance with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel continued to strengthen. Together, they ran bootlegging networks, gambling operations, and even brothels. Luciano admired Lansky's financial genius and Siegel's fearlessness. More importantly, he recognized that by working across ethnic lines, they could outmaneuver older bosses who insisted on sticking within their own communities. Luciano's willingness to break barriers gave him access to a wider network of contacts and resources than most Italian mobsters of his generation. Yet his position under Mafia came with growing tension. Luciano was ambitious, and he resented the limitations imposed by Mafia's old world mentality. Joe the boss was greedy, demanding larger cuts of profits, and quick to settle disputes with violence rather than negotiation. Luciano, by contrast, believed in cooperation and efficiency. He saw how constant infighting weakened the underworld, and he dreamed of a system where rival groups could work together under a unified structure. But for the moment, he had to bide his time, paying tribute to Mafia while building his own empire quietly. Meanwhile, another powerful force was rising in New York's underworld. Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian boss from Castellammare del Golfo. Maranzano represented the old mafia traditions even more rigidly than Mafia. He believed in strict hierarchy, loyalty to the Sicilian code, and absolute control. His arrival in New York would soon set the stage for a violent struggle between the Mafia and Maranzano factions. Luciano, caught between these two titans, began to see the outlines of his own destiny. He understood that the coming conflict, what would later be called the Castellammare's War, was not just a fight between two bosses. It was a chance to reshape the underworld itself. If the old guard destroyed each other, men like him could rise from the ashes and create something new. During these years, Luciano also began to cultivate a public image. He dressed sharply in tailored suits, frequented high-class nightclubs, and associated with celebrities, businessmen, and politicians. He wanted to project more than the image of a thug. He wanted to be seen as a man of influence. In many ways, this strategy mirrored that of Arnold Rothstein, who had taught Luciano that appearances mattered. A gangster who looked like a businessman could blend into society, wielding power more effectively than someone who relied only on fear. Still, Luciano never forgot his roots. He remained a fixture in the speakeasies, the gambling dens, and the smoky backrooms where deals were made. He maintained close ties to his street-level soldiers, ensuring their loyalty with both money and respect. Unlike Mafia, who treated subordinates as disposable, Luciano built a network of men who felt invested in his success. This loyalty would prove invaluable when the time came to challenge the old order. By 1928, Tensions between Masiria and Maranzano were reaching a boiling point. Both sought to control the lucrative bootlegging trade, and both demanded loyalty from younger gangsters like Luciano. For Luciano, the decision was complicated. Staying with Masiria meant loyalty to the man who had given him opportunities, but also meant remaining shackled to outdated methods. Aligning with Maranzano offered no better future, as Maranzano was even more traditional and rigid. Luciano began to play a dangerous double game. He pretended loyalty to Masiria, while secretly making overtures to Maranzano's faction. More importantly, he was plotting for himself. He envisioned an underworld run not by one boss or another, but by a commission. A council of leaders who could cooperate, divide territories, and settle disputes without endless bloodshed. This idea was revolutionary, and it marked the beginning of Luciano's transformation from ambitious gangster to architect of modern organized crime. As the 1920s drew to a close, the stage was set for chaos. Prohibition had made criminals rich beyond imagination, but it had also fueled rivalries, betrayals, and wars. Joe Masiria ruled like a tyrant, demanding tribute and loyalty, but his grip was slipping. Salvatore Maranzano was waiting in the shadows, ready to challenge him. And in between them stood Lucky Luciano, smiling in his sharp suits, shaking hands with allies on all sides, and quietly plotting to outlive them all. The next chapter of his life would be written in blood. The Castellamarese War was coming, and Luciano would not only survive it, he would use it to reshape the Mafia into a modern empire. The years under Masiria had taught him loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of ambition. Now he was ready to gamble everything for power. The Prohibition era of the 1920s was the crucible in which Lucky Luciano transformed from a promising young gangster into a national figure. It was during this decade that he mastered the arts of organization, bribery, and ruthless efficiency. The United States government had outlawed alcohol, but Americans would not stop drinking. That gap between law and demand became the underworld's greatest opportunity, and no one exploited it better than Luciano. By the early 1920s, speakeasies flourished in New York, hidden behind unmarked doors, in basements, or disguised as restaurants. These illegal bars served liquor to a thirsty public. Jazz bands played, flappers danced, and politicians who voted for Prohibition quietly sipped whiskey in the back rooms. Behind the glamour, though, was a vast machinery of smuggling, brewing and distribution, an underground economy worth millions. Luciano was at the center of it. He organized liquor shipments from Canada, where alcohol was legal, and smuggled them across the border into New York. Trucks, trains, and even small boats carried barrels of whiskey and rum. To ensure safe passage, Luciano perfected the art of bribery. Customs officers, dock workers, policemen, and politicians all received envelopes stuffed with cash. In Luciano's eyes, bribes were not a side expense. They were an investment. Every official he bought was a guarantee that his business could run smoothly. He later explained his philosophy simply: it was cheaper to buy a cop than to kill one, and far less messy. Luciano also invested in breweries hidden in warehouses and basements. These underground operations produced beer for local speakeasies. He made sure his product was reliable, distributed quickly, and delivered to the right clients. His operations began to look less like a gang and more like a corporation. Trucks followed schedules, drivers reported to managers, and profits were tallied with precision. At the same time, Luciano expanded into gambling. Illegal card games, dice tables, and betting operations were highly profitable, and they fit naturally alongside bootlegging. He opened gambling parlors and partnered with Lansky, whose mathematical mind could keep the books straight and ensure the house always won. Gambling dens catered to working-class men, while more exclusive backrooms attracted politicians, businessmen, and even celebrities. These spaces were not just for profit. They were places where Luciano built influence. A politician who owed him money from gambling debts was easier to control than one who simply took a bribe. Luciano's friend Bugsy Siegel played a key role during this period. Siegel was bold, violent, and unpredictable, but his fearlessness made him valuable. He enforced Luciano's will when necessary, intimidating rivals and punishing traitors. Siegel's reputation as a killer complemented Luciano's image as a businessman. Together with Lansky, they formed a triangle of power that balanced muscle, brains, and vision. Yet Luciano's greatest strength was his ability to build alliances beyond ethnicity. He worked with Jewish gangs, Irish mobs, and Italian outfits alike. Most bosses of the time clung to their own kind, but Luciano understood that money had no nationality. If someone could help him make a profit, he would work with them. This philosophy gave him access to wider markets and stronger networks than his rivals. It also laid the foundation for what he later envisioned as a national syndicate. Of course, the 1920s underworld was not a smooth enterprise. Competition for territory often erupted into violence. Trucks were hijacked, breweries raided, and speakeasies bombed. Rival gangs fought bitterly for control. Luciano managed to thrive in this chaos because he balanced toughness with diplomacy. If a deal could be struck, he preferred negotiation. But if an enemy refused, he did not hesitate to send his men with guns. The murder rate in New York soared during these years, and bootlegging wars painted the streets red. Yet Luciano kept his own profile polished. He dressed impeccably in tailored suits, frequented high-class clubs, and moved in circles that included entertainers, businessmen, and politicians. To the public, he looked less like a street thug and more like a wealthy playboy. He cultivated this image deliberately. The less he looked like a gangster, the harder it was for authorities to pin crimes on him. Another important aspect of Luciano's expansion was prostitution. Though he would later be prosecuted on vice charges, in the 1920s he viewed prostitution as another business opportunity. Brothels in New York generated steady income, and Luciano organized them with the same efficiency he applied to bootlegging and gambling. He set up systems to collect profits, ensured police were paid off, and kept competition in check. It was controversial even among gangsters. Some considered prostitution dishonorable, but Luciano cared only about profits. Throughout the decade, Luciano's mentor Arnold Rothstein remained an influential figure. Rothstein financed deals, provided connections, and taught Luciano to think big. But in 1928, Rothstein was murdered after a dispute over gambling debts. His death sent shockwaves through the underworld. For Luciano, it was a personal loss, but also a challenge. Without Rothstein's guidance, he had to step into a leadership role himself. He was no longer the student, he was becoming the master. By 1929, Luciano's empire was vast. Bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution brought in millions of dollars. His operations stretched beyond New York, with connections in Chicago, Philadelphia, and even Florida. He had friends in City Hall, allies in police precincts, and partnerships with rival gangs who preferred profit to war. Yet success also brought enemies. Joe Masseria, the boss under whom Luciano technically served, demanded a larger share of the profits. Masseria viewed Luciano's independence as a threat. At the same time, Salvatore Maranzano, the rival Sicilian Don, was building his own power base. The tensions between Masseria and Maranzano were about to explode into a bloody conflict known as the Castellamarese War. Luciano, caught between the two, realized he would have to choose sides, or perhaps create a third path. But before the war began, he had already proven himself. By the end of the 1920s, Lucky Luciano was no longer just a name whispered in speakeasies. He was one of the most powerful gangsters in New York, a man who blended violence and business in a way no one else had mastered. The 1920s were his proving ground. In less than a decade, he had risen from a street hustler to a millionaire bootlegger. He had learned how to bribe cops, negotiate deals, manage networks, and maintain loyalty. He had survived beatings, betrayals, and police raids. And he had built an image of sophistication that kept him above the fray. But success was only the beginning. The coming war between Masiria and Maranzano would test every lesson he had learned. It would pit loyalty against ambition, tradition against innovation, and blood against profit. For Luciano, the 1920s were the rise. The 1930s would bring the reckoning. By 1930, the underworld of New York stood on the brink of chaos. Prohibition had made bootleggers rich, but it had also sharpened rivalries to a razor's edge. The Italian Mafia, fractured by old loyalties and competing visions of power, was preparing for war. At the center of this conflict stood two titans of the old order, Joe, the boss, Masiria and Salvatore Maranzano, and caught between them was Charles, Lucky Luciano, the ambitious young gangster whose decisions would change organized crime forever. The seeds of the Castellamarese War were sown in deep cultural divides. On one side was Masiria, a Neapolitan who had risen to become the self-proclaimed boss of all bosses in New York. He ruled through fear, extortion, and sheer brutality. On the other side was Maranzano, a Sicilian from Castellammare del Golfo, who arrived in America with dreams of creating a mafia empire modeled on the traditions of his homeland. Both men were stubborn, both craved absolute control, and both saw each other as the single greatest obstacle to dominance. The underworld quickly split into two camps. Masiria commanded loyalty from many established families in Manhattan, while Maranzano gathered support from Sicilian newcomers and younger upstarts who despised Masiria's greed. The conflict escalated into open violence. Gunfights erupted in the streets, bodies piled up in alleyways, and the newspapers carried daily stories of gangland killings. New York became a battlefield where bootleggers, gamblers, and enforcers fought for their boss's honor and survival. Lucky Luciano, though formally aligned with Masiria, played a dangerous double game. He owed his early rise to Masiria's patronage, but he increasingly saw the boss as outdated and short-sighted. Masiria demanded unquestioned obedience and took too large a share of profits. He treated alliances as temporary conveniences rather than lasting partnerships. Luciano, by contrast, believed in cooperation across ethnic and territorial lines. He envisioned a future where the mafia functioned more like a corporation, with leaders sharing power instead of endlessly fighting for supremacy. During the early months of the war, Luciano maintained the appearance of loyalty. He attended Masiria's meetings, sent soldiers to fight in the streets, and paid tribute as expected. But privately, he was already considering alternatives. He knew that whichever side won, the future would not belong to men like Masiria or Maranzano. It would belong to men like himself, modern, pragmatic, and willing to put business above tradition. The violence of the Castellamarese War was relentless. Drive-by shootings became common. Kidnappings and assassinations were daily risks. Luciano's closest allies, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, advised him to tread carefully. They recognized that Masiria was a sinking ship. Every month, Maranzano gained strength, while Masiria grew more desperate. Luciano understood this as well, but he was too clever to simply switch sides. If he abandoned Masiria too soon, he would be branded a traitor and hunted by both camps. If he waited too long, he risked being dragged down with Maseria's inevitable fall. Timing was everything. Luciano's survival strategy was subtle. He maintained open communication with Maranzano's men, signaling his willingness to cooperate in the future. At the same time, he reassured Maseria of his loyalty. He made sure to keep his own operations running smoothly, avoiding unnecessary risks while others bled in the streets. His ability to balance both sides during the height of the war marked him as a man of unusual foresight. The turning point came in 1931. By then, the war had dragged on for more than a year, claiming dozens of lives and draining resources. New York's mafia was fractured, weakened, and vulnerable to law enforcement. Luciano saw clearly that the old system, where one boss ruled as capo dei capi, or boss of bosses, was unsustainable. The constant fighting destroyed profits and left them open to outside threats. He decided that the only way forward was to eliminate both Maseria and Maranzano and replace the system with something new. The first step was Maseria. Luciano realized that aligning himself permanently with Maranzano would require a dramatic gesture of loyalty. More importantly, Maseria's arrogance and greed had alienated many of his allies, leaving him increasingly isolated. Luciano carefully plotted the betrayal. He met secretly with Maranzano's representatives, striking a deal if Luciano helped eliminate Maseria. Maranzano would end the war and allow Luciano to play a leading role in the new order. On April 15, 1931, the trap was sprung. Luciano lured Maseria to a Coney Island restaurant under the pretense of discussing peace. They dined together, played cards, and appeared to be reconciling. At the right moment, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. While he was gone, gunmen loyal to Maranzano, reportedly including Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese, burst into the room. Maseria was shot multiple times, slumping lifeless over the card table. Luciano returned moments later, feigning shock at the scene. But the truth was clear. The betrayal had been orchestrated by his hand. The murder of Maseria effectively ended the first phase of the Castellamarese War. Maranzano emerged as the undisputed boss of bosses. He celebrated his victory by restructuring the mafia into 5 families, each with its own hierarchy, while declaring himself the supreme ruler. Luciano was rewarded for his role in the betrayal, given leadership over his own organization, and granted Maranzano's trust. But even in triumph, Luciano remained wary. He had traded one outdated tyrant for another. Maranzano, though more strategic than Maseria, was still bound by old Sicilian traditions. He demanded rituals of loyalty, spoke constantly of Roman legions and Julius Caesar, and insisted on absolute obedience. To Luciano, it was simply Maseria all over again, dressed in different robes. The betrayal he had engineered was only the beginning. The Castellamarese War had taught Luciano valuable lessons. It showed him the destructive futility of constant power struggles, the fragility of alliances based on fear, and the need for a new model of organized crime. He had survived where many had fallen because he understood timing, loyalty, and betrayal better than anyone else. More importantly, he now had the opportunity to reshape the underworld according to his vision. Luciano had risen through cunning diplomacy and calculated ruthlessness. He had betrayed his own boss, but he justified it as necessary for the greater good of the underworld. To him, Maseria represented the past, and Luciano represented the future. The war was over, but the battle for control of organized crime was far from finished. For the moment, Maranzano sat on the throne, but Lucky Luciano was already planning his next move, and this time he would not be content to serve anyone. The Castellamarese War had ended in blood, but out of its ashes, a new order was beginning to take shape. Luciano had survived, thrived, and positioned himself as the man who could bridge the gap between tradition and modernity. The betrayal of Mafia was not the end of the story. It was only the prologue to the empire he was about to build. The spring of 1931 marked a dramatic shift in the underworld of New York, with Joe, the boss, Mafia dead on the floor of a Coney Island restaurant. Salvatore Maranzano stood as the unquestioned victor of the Castellamarese War. To many, it appeared that Maranzano had finally unified the Italian Mafia under one ruler. But for Charles, Lucky Luciano, the war's end was not the conclusion. It was the beginning of a far greater ambition. In the weeks following Mafia's murder, Maranzano wasted no time in reshaping the Mafia. He reorganized the fractured underworld into 5 distinct families, each with its own boss: underboss, consigliere, caporgimes, and soldiers. This structure formalized power and created order where chaos had reigned. Luciano himself was appointed boss of one of the most powerful families, commanding influence across bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution rackets. On the surface, it was a reward for loyalty and proof of Maranzano's trust. But Luciano quickly realized that Maranzano's victory came with a price. Though he had modernized the mafia structure, Maranzano clung to old world traditions with an iron grip. He demanded rituals of loyalty, insisting that all gangsters swear fealty directly to him. He likened himself to Julius Caesar, envisioning his lieutenants as Roman legions who owed their devotion to a single emperor. While this grandiose style impressed some, it struck Luciano as foolish. The underworld was not ancient Rome, it was a modern business empire fueled by prohibition profits. And in a business empire, absolute dictatorship was a liability. For Luciano, Maranzano represented the same problem as Mafia, only dressed in Sicilian pride and Latin rhetoric. Both men demanded absolute obedience. Both insisted on being capo dei capi, the boss of bosses, and both failed to see the larger picture. Luciano believed the Mafia should operate more like a board of directors, with leaders cooperating for shared profits instead of constantly battling for supremacy. He had no interest in replacing Mafia with another dictator. Still, Luciano played the part of loyal subordinate. He attended Maranzano's meetings, smiled at his speeches about Caesar and empire, and assured him of unwavering allegiance. All the while, he listened, observed, and planned. He knew Maranzano did not trust him completely. The old Don saw Luciano as ambitious modern and dangerously independent. And he was right. Luciano had no intention of living under Maranzano's shadow. Throughout the summer of 1931, tensions quietly simmered. Maranzano began consolidating his power, demanding greater cuts from rackets and issuing orders that grated against Luciano's vision of business. He also began plotting to eliminate potential rivals, including Luciano himself. The boss of bosses had grown suspicious that his young protégé might one day betray him. He instructed loyal soldiers to prepare for Luciano's assassination, unaware that Luciano was already moving first. Luciano's response was bold. Instead of relying solely on his Italian allies, he turned to his Jewish partners, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Together, they devised a plan that would outmaneuver Maranzano's Sicilian network. Luciano knew that Maranzano's men would recognize Italian gunmen approaching his office. The solution was unconventional. Use Jewish hitmen who could pose as law enforcement officers. It was a strategy that epitomized Luciano's willingness to break tradition for the sake of efficiency. On September 10, 1931, the plan was executed. Maranzano was in his office at the New York Central Building on Park Avenue, reviewing papers and holding meetings. Suddenly, a group of men entered. Dressed as government agents, they carried badges, announced a raid, and quickly gained access. Maranzano, suspicious but unprepared, allowed them into his private office. Once inside, the impostors revealed their true purpose. They stabbed and shot Maranzano repeatedly, leaving him dead on the floor. The self-proclaimed Caesar of the underworld had met his end not by rival dons, but by Luciano's hired assassins disguised as officers of the law. With Maranzano's death, the old order of Capo Dia Capi was buried alongside him. Luciano wasted no time in declaring that the system of a single supreme boss was over. In its place, he established the Commission, a governing council composed of the bosses of the 5 families, along with representatives from other powerful crime groups across the country. The Commission would serve as a board of directors for the Mafia, settling disputes, dividing territories, and overseeing national operations. This new system reflected Luciano's vision: cooperation over chaos, business over vendetta. It ensured that no single man could dominate the underworld the way Masiria and Maranzano had attempted. Instead, power would be balanced among equals, with Luciano as the quiet architect behind the scenes. His foresight turned the Mafia from a loose network of gangs into a national syndicate with rules, order, and structure. Luciano's ascension was as much about philosophy as it was about power. Where the old dons clung to Sicilian codes of honor and secrecy, Luciano embraced pragmatism. He did not care about birthplace or bloodlines. If a man could make money and stay loyal to business, he was useful. This openness allowed him to maintain partnerships with Jewish and Irish gangs, broadening his reach far beyond the insular world of traditional mafia bosses. It also gave him influence in cities like Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit, creating a national web of organized crime. The months following Maranzano's murder saw Luciano cement his authority. He surrounded himself with loyal lieutenants: Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and continued to rely on Lansky and Siegel as trusted partners. Together, they expanded into narcotics, labor racketeering, and real estate, diversifying their empire. Luciano's family alone controlled millions in revenue, while his influence through the Commission gave him a voice in nearly every major criminal enterprise in America. Yet Luciano never boasted of being boss of bosses. That title, he insisted, was abolished forever. He preferred to be first among equals, guiding the underworld with quiet authority rather than overt dictatorship. This humility was partly genuine and partly strategic. By refusing the crown, he avoided the resentment that had doomed Masiria and Maranzano. He was content to let others believe they shared power, even as he shaped the Mafia's future from behind the curtain. Looking back, historians often see Maranzano's death as the true birth of modern organized crime in America. Luciano had not only survived 2 bosses, he had replaced their feudal system with a syndicate that could endure for decades. It was a turning point that demonstrated his genius, the ability to recognize when tradition had become weakness, and the courage to replace it with something new. By the end of 1931, Luciano was the most powerful gangster in the United States. He was young, wealthy, and untouchable. He had killed his mentor, betrayed his boss, and outmaneuvered his rivals. More importantly, he had created a system that made the Mafia stronger than ever. For the first time in American history, organized crime had a governing body, a commission that would regulate its affairs like a corporation. But power once attained is never secure. Luciano had built an empire, but empires attract enemies. Law enforcement rival gangs, and even ambitious men within his own organization would all eventually test his authority. For now, however, he stood at the pinnacle of success. The streets that once knew him as a scrappy immigrant boy now bowed to him as the mastermind of a criminal syndicate. Salvatore Maranzano's dream of being Caesar ended in blood on a Park Avenue floor. Luciano's dream, by contrast, had only just begun. The autumn of 1931 ushered in a new age for organized crime in America. With Salvatore Maranzano dead and the old feudal system of bosses abolished, Lucky Luciano stood at the center of a revolution. He had replaced chaos with structure, vendetta with business, and tyrannical leadership with a council of equals. This council, known as the Commission, would become his greatest legacy and his greatest instrument of power. Luciano envisioned the Commission as a board of directors for the Mafia. At its core were the heads of the 5 families of New York, Luciano himself: Joseph Bonanno, Vincent Mangano, Joseph Profassi, and Tommy Gagliano. But the Commission extended beyond New York. Leaders from Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, and other cities were invited to participate, ensuring that organized crime across the United States was linked under one umbrella. The idea was simple: disputes would be settled by negotiation, not war. Territory would be divided fairly, and profits shared. For the first time, the Mafia functioned like a national syndicate. Luciano's brilliance lay in how he used the Commission. He positioned himself not as a dictator, but as the man who kept the machine running. By presenting himself as first among equals, he avoided the jealousy and resentment that had doomed both Masseria and Maranzano. Yet behind the scenes, his influence was unmatched. His allies, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, ensured that Luciano's voice carried the greatest weight in any decision. Quietly, he had achieved what his predecessors failed to do: unify the underworld while avoiding the risks of absolute power. Under Luciano's reign, the Mafia entered its golden age of prosperity. Bootlegging remained profitable, though by 1933 Prohibition was nearing its end. Anticipating this, Luciano and his partners diversified. Gambling became a cornerstone, from underground casinos in New York to race-fixing operations. They invested in labor racketeering, infiltrating unions to control construction, shipping, and trucking. They expanded into loan sharking, narcotics trafficking, and even the film industry. Luciano's empire was vast, touching nearly every aspect of American life where profit could be squeezed. Frank Costello, Luciano's consigliere and trusted strategist, played a key role. Known as the Prime Minister, Costello specialized in politics. He cultivated relationships with judges, police chiefs, and city officials, ensuring protection from the law. Where Luciano bought silence with cash, Costello secured influence with favors and friendships. Together, they built a web of political protection that shielded their empire from serious threats. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky managed finances with mathematical precision. He laundered money through legitimate businesses, reinvested profits in real estate, and explored opportunities in Cuba and Florida. Lansky's genius ensured that Luciano's empire was not just powerful, but sustainable. Bugsy Siegel, ever the bold enforcer, kept rivals in check through intimidation and violence. And Vito Genovese, though ambitious and sometimes treacherous, remained a loyal lieutenant during these years, enforcing Luciano's authority within the Italian ranks. Luciano also encouraged expansion beyond New York. He supported the rise of the Chicago outfit under Frank Nitti, who succeeded Al Capone after his imprisonment. He built alliances with Midwestern families, ensuring that the Mafia's reach stretched from coast to coast. Through the Commission, disputes were resolved without bloodshed. If one family encroached on another's territory, the Commission intervened. If rivalries flared, leaders voted on settlements. The days of endless gang wars seemed to be over. Luciano's ability to balance tradition with modernity was key to his success. He respected the Sicilian roots of the Mafia, but rejected the suffocating rituals and xenophobia of the old duns. He welcomed partnerships with Jewish and Irish criminals, expanding opportunities for profit. He valued loyalty, but he placed greater emphasis on competence. If a man could make money and stay disciplined, Luciano did not care about his ancestry. This pragmatism made him a revolutionary figure in organized crime. Yet Luciano's reign was not without its challenges. Inside his organization, ambition simmered. Vito Genovese, in particular, resented playing second fiddle. Genovese dreamed of replacing Luciano as boss and sought opportunities to strengthen his own position. Luciano, ever the strategist, kept Genovese close but watched him carefully. He understood that power within the Mafia was never secure. Every ally could one day become a rival. Outside the underworld, law enforcement was beginning to take notice. Though Luciano was careful to maintain the image of a wealthy businessman, his name was whispered in police stations and federal offices. District attorneys in New York began compiling evidence, hoping to bring charges that would stick. But Luciano's network of bribed officials and political allies kept him safe. For the time being, the government lacked both the will and the means to strike at him directly. The end of Prohibition in 1933 posed both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, the repeal of the 18th Amendment eliminated the bootlegging profits that had fueled Luciano's rise. On the other hand, it freed him from the most visible source of police attention and allowed him to expand into more discreet rackets. Gambling, prostitution, and narcotics filled the void, and Luciano's empire continued to grow. He also invested in legitimate businesses, ensuring that some of his fortune could withstand scrutiny. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had achieved what no gangster before him had managed. He had turned organized crime into an empire that operated like a multinational corporation. His commission provided stability, his allies provided strength, and his vision provided direction. He was not just a gangster. He was the architect of a system that would outlast him by decades. But success carried its own risks. Luciano's growing wealth and influence made him a target for reformers and prosecutors eager to make their names. Among them was a rising district attorney named Thomas E. Dewey. Young, ambitious, and determined to tackle organized crime, Dewey would soon focus his attention on Luciano. And while Luciano's empire seemed untouchable, it was in fact vulnerable in ways he did not yet realize. For now, though, the early 1930s belonged to Lucky Luciano. He was no longer the scrappy immigrant boy of the Lower East Side, nor the ambitious lieutenant under Mafia. He was the boss of a powerful family, the quiet ruler of the commission, and the man who had transformed organized crime from a bloody free for all into a disciplined, profitable syndicate. The Mafia had entered its modern era, and Luciano was its architect. The commission ensured peace, but peace would not last forever. Rivals, law enforcement, and betrayal would all return in the years to come. Yet during this golden age, Luciano stood at the height of his power. Wealthy, respected, and feared, he had survived the violence of the past and built a system for the future. For the underworld, he was not just lucky, he was indispensable. In December 1933, the United States repealed the 18th Amendment, officially ending Prohibition. Across the country, people celebrated with champagne, whiskey, and beer, raising glasses to the end of an era that had turned ordinary citizens into lawbreakers and criminals into millionaires. For most bootleggers, repeal meant disaster. The government had taken away their most profitable racket, and many gangs collapsed under the weight of lost revenue. But for Charles, Lucky, Luciano, the end of Prohibition was not a death sentence. It was an opportunity. Luciano had anticipated the repeal. Unlike short-sighted gangsters who relied entirely on alcohol smuggling, he had already begun diversifying his empire. His revenues now flowed from gambling dens, narcotics trafficking, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and, most controversially, prostitution. The repeal of prohibition may have ended the bootlegging bonanza, but it freed Luciano from the constant raids and violent wars that had plagued the 1920s. He pivoted his focus toward enterprises that were harder to detect, more lucrative, and more sustainable in the long run. Among these, prostitution became central. Luciano saw vice not as a sideline, but as a business in itself, one that could be organized, standardized, and controlled just like bootlegging had been. He and his associates consolidated brothels across New York, eliminating small independent operators and forcing women to work under their system. Pimps, madams, and enforcers were all placed under centralized management. Weekly earnings were collected with the same efficiency as union dues. For Luciano, prostitution was not about moral judgment, it was about profit. This decision, however, planted the seeds of his eventual downfall. Unlike gambling or loan sharking, prostitution left trails of human victims who could testify. Women working in his brothels, often trapped by debt or coercion, resented the system. They had little loyalty and far more incentive to cooperate with authorities if offered protection. Luciano did not yet realize how dangerous this vulnerability would become. Gambling, by contrast, was both lucrative and less risky. From secret craps games in Harlem to high-end poker clubs in Midtown, Luciano's network of gambling operations generated steady cash. Frank Costello, with his gift for political connections, ensured that raids were rare and prosecutions rarer still. Politicians and police officers who enjoyed the thrill of a night at the tables often left with more than winnings. They left indebted to Luciano's empire. Labor racketeering was another cornerstone of Luciano's post-prohibition empire. With the construction industry booming in the mid-1930s, unions became gold mines for extortion. Luciano's men infiltrated the dockworkers' unions, trucking unions, and building trades. Contractors who wanted jobs completed on time had to pay insurance to the Mafia. Those who resisted found their workers on strike, their trucks vandalized, or their shipments lost. The money from union control flowed steadily into Luciano's coffers, and it gave him leverage in legitimate industries as well. Despite his underworld activities, Luciano was careful to cultivate a public image. He dressed impeccably in hand-tailored suits, smoked expensive cigars, and dined in the finest restaurants. He moved in circles that included Broadway stars, politicians, and businessmen. To the public, he appeared less like a gangster and more like a wealthy playboy. Photographs of Luciano at racetracks, nightclubs, and fashionable hotels painted a picture of sophistication. He seemed untouchable, a man who had risen from the immigrant slums to the heights of New York society. Luciano encouraged this perception. He understood that image was a weapon as powerful as fear. If he could pass as a successful businessman, then prosecutors would struggle to pin him as a criminal mastermind. Even within the underworld, his persona inspired respect. He was not a thug hiding in shadows. He was a figure who moved confidently among the elite. This aura made it harder for rivals to attack him and harder for authorities to bring him down. Yet beneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. Luciano's reliance on prostitution brought him into the crosshairs of reformers who sought to clean up New York. In particular, civic groups and newspapers began publishing exposés on the vice racket that preyed on young women. These stories stirred public outrage, and politicians who had long tolerated gambling and loan sharking began to face pressure to act. Meanwhile, within his own circle, tension simmered. Vito Genovese, always ambitious, began maneuvering for greater power. Though he outwardly remained loyal, he quietly resented Luciano's dominance. Genovese's willingness to use violence without restraint clashed with Luciano's preference for diplomacy and order. Lucky kept him close, but he never fully trusted him. The broader underworld also grew restless. While the commission had brought relative peace, rivalries never disappeared. Disputes over territory and profit still erupted, though now they were usually settled behind closed doors instead of in open warfare. Luciano's skill lay in keeping the peace through negotiation, but he knew that any sign of weakness could invite chaos. By 1935, Luciano was at the height of his power. His organization controlled millions of dollars in revenue each year. His political protection remained strong, and his public image as a dashing businessman concealed his criminal empire. Yet he was also walking a dangerous line. The same confidence that had carried him to the top now made him a target. Reformers, prosecutors, and journalists all looked to make an example of him. And unlike Masiria or Maranzano, Luciano's enemies were not just gangsters. They were men of the law. Among them was a young district attorney named Thomas E. Dewey. Ambitious and relentless, Dewey had made his name prosecuting bootleggers and racketeers. Now he set his sights on Luciano. Where others saw a wealthy playboy, Dewey saw the mastermind of a vast vice empire that degraded women and corrupted the city. Dewey's campaign against Luciano would become one of the most famous prosecutions in American history, and it would test whether Lucky truly was untouchable. For the moment, however, Luciano basked in his success. The repeal of Prohibition had closed one chapter, but he had written another. He had proven that organized crime could adapt, evolve, and thrive no matter the laws of the land. Gambling dens, brothels, labor unions, and narcotics replaced the speakeasies, and the money never stopped flowing. Luciano had turned vice into a business, crime into a corporation, and himself into a legend. But legends attract enemies. The public image he cultivated so carefully could not shield him forever. Behind the sharp suits and easy smile, he remained what he had always been, a man who had risen by betrayal, violence, and ambition. And in the years ahead, the law would come for him with a determination he had never faced before. By the mid-1930s, Charles Lucky Luciano stood as the undisputed power behind organized crime in New York City. His wealth, influence, and political protection made him appear untouchable. But history has a way of turning invincibility into vulnerability. In 1935, a young district attorney named Thomas E. Dewey began a crusade to rid New York of vice rackets, and Luciano soon found himself in the crosshairs of the law like never before. Dewey was no ordinary prosecutor. Just 33 years old when he rose to prominence, he was ambitious, disciplined, and determined to make his name by tackling organized crime. Where others saw Luciano as an untouchable figure wrapped in respectability, Dewey saw a criminal empire rooted in the exploitation of women through prostitution. He believed that by striking at Luciano, he could cripple the syndicate that profited from vice and corruption. For Dewey, this was more than a case. It was a mission. Dewey began quietly, building a special unit devoted to investigating racketeering and vice. He recruited young lawyers and investigators who shared his zeal. Rather than targeting street-level pimps or madams, he aimed straight for the top, determined to prove that Luciano himself was the head of the city's prostitution network. It was a daring strategy, one that required evidence linking the highest gangster in New York to the most degrading corners of vice. Gathering that evidence was no easy task. Luciano lived carefully, never signing documents, never appearing at crime scenes and rarely giving orders directly. But Dewey's investigators turned their focus to the women who worked in the brothels. Unlike hardened gangsters, these women were vulnerable. Many resented the mafia's stranglehold on their lives, and some were eager for a way out. Under pressure, they began to talk. One by one, prostitutes and madams described a system of centralized control where earnings were collected weekly and protection money flowed upward. They told of beatings, coercion, and fear. And at the top, they insisted, was Lucky Luciano. Some claimed they had seen his lieutenants delivering orders, others that Luciano himself took a direct interest in the profits. Whether every detail was accurate or not, the testimonies painted a damning picture of a vast vice empire. In February 1936, Dewey struck. Police launched coordinated raids on dozens of brothels across New York, arresting hundreds of prostitutes, madams, and pimps. The raids sent shockwaves through the underworld. For years, these houses of prostitution had operated openly, protected by bribes and political influence. Now, under Dewey's command, the protection crumbled. The women arrested faced harsh sentences if they remained silent, but leniency if they cooperated. Many chose to testify, and the case against Luciano began to take shape. Luciano, at first, dismissed the threat. He had survived gang wars, betrayals, and assassination attempts. To him, a young prosecutor with political ambitions seemed like just another nuisance. He believed his lawyers and political contacts could quash the investigation. But Dewey was relentless. He refused bribes, ignored threats, and pressed forward with a determination that impressed the public. Newspapers hailed him as a crusader, and his reputation soared. In April 1936, Luciano was indicted on compulsory prostitution charges, accused of being the mastermind behind New York's vice racket. The charges shocked the public. For years, Luciano had cultivated the image of a dashing businessman, a man about town who mingled with society's elite. Now he was portrayed as a pimp, profiting from the exploitation of women. The contrast was devastating to his carefully built reputation. Luciano attempted to avoid arrest by fleeing to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a resort town known as a haven for gangsters. But his notoriety betrayed him. Recognized by police, he was arrested and extradited back to New York under heavy guard. For the first time in his career, Luciano faced the full weight of the American justice system. The trial began in May 1936 and quickly became a media spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to glimpse the famous gangster. Inside, the prosecution presented witness after witness, prostitutes, madams and pimps, who testified that Luciano controlled the vice racket. They described how earnings flowed up the chain of command, how Luciano's lieutenants enforced discipline, and how he personally profited from their exploitation. Luciano's defense attorneys fought fiercely, arguing that the witnesses were unreliable, coerced, or motivated by promises of leniency. They painted Luciano as a businessman unfairly targeted by an ambitious prosecutor. But the weight of testimony was overwhelming. Though Luciano himself never touched the women, never collected the money directly, the case rested on the idea of command responsibility. That as the leader of the syndicate, he bore ultimate responsibility for its crimes. Throughout the trial, Luciano remained composed. He dressed impeccably, spoke politely, and carried himself with the calm of a man used to command. But behind the mask of confidence, he must have felt the pressure. Unlike the chaotic gang wars of the past, this battle could not be won with guns. It would be decided by jurors, by public opinion, and by the determination of a prosecutor who refused to back down. On June 6, 1936, after weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict guilty on 60, 2 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano, once the most powerful gangster in New York, was sentenced to a term of 30 to 50 years in prison. The courtroom erupted with shock. Some celebrated seeing justice delivered at last. Others doubted the fairness of the conviction, suspecting that Dewey's case relied too heavily on questionable witnesses. But for Luciano, the result was clear: his reign was over. The fall of Lucky Luciano was more than the downfall of a man. It was a turning point in the history of organized crime. The commission survived, but its leader was gone. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and others scrambled to fill the void, each maneuvering for influence. Meanwhile, Luciano himself was shipped to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, a maximum security prison known as Little Siberia for its remote location and harsh conditions. From his cell, Luciano remained a figure of fascination. Some saw him as a criminal mastermind brought low by justice, others as a victim of an overzealous prosecutor. But one truth was undeniable: the man who had reshaped organized crime in America now sat behind bars, his power broken, his freedom gone. For Thomas Dewey, the conviction was a career-defining triumph. He became a national figure, hailed as the man who had brought down Lucky Luciano. His victory paved the way for a future in politics, where he would run for governor of New York and even for president of the United States. For Luciano, however, the trial marked the beginning of a new chapter, one of confinement, adaptation, and eventual redemption during wartime. But in 1936, as the prison gates closed behind him, he could not have known what lay ahead. He had survived the streets, the wars, and the betrayals. Yet now it was the law that had finally caught him. When Charles Lucky Luciano was led through the gates of Clinton Correctional Facility in 1936, many believed his story had ended. He had been sentenced to a staggering 30 to 50 years for compulsory prostitution, a sentence designed to break both the man and the organization he built. The public saw him as finished, a gangster brought low at last. But history rarely follows the script of finality, and Luciano, even behind bars, proved that his influence reached far beyond the prison walls. Clinton Prison, known as Little Siberia, was no place for a man accustomed to luxury. Located in the remote Adirondack Mountains, it was cold, harsh, and unforgiving. Luciano, stripped of his tailored suits and nightclubs, now wore prison blues and followed the routines of confinement. Yet, unlike many inmates, he was no ordinary prisoner. His reputation preceded him, and even within the prison hierarchy, Luciano commanded respect. At first, Luciano struggled to adapt. He had lived as a man of freedom and power, and now guards barked orders and locked steel doors behind him. But his resilience, honed on the streets of New York, allowed him to endure. Slowly, he carved out a place for himself in the prison system. Other inmates, many with criminal backgrounds of their own, gravitated toward him. He became a source of advice, a mediator in disputes, and a figure of authority even behind bars. Outside, his organization faced turbulence. With Luciano gone, a power vacuum emerged. Frank Costello, the smooth-talking prime minister, assumed much of the political leadership, while Vito Genovese, ambitious as ever, attempted to maneuver for dominance. Genovese's plans, however, were interrupted when he fled to Italy in 1937 after a murder indictment. That left Costello in charge, a man far more interested in stability than chaos. Under his stewardship, Luciano's empire endured. The 5 families remained intact, and the commission continued to function, proving that Luciano's structure was strong enough to survive even without its architect. From prison, Luciano still received news of the underworld. Through visits from lawyers, friends, and allies, he stayed informed. His influence, though indirect, lingered. Costello occasionally sought his counsel, and decisions made in New York often carried the weight of his approval. For a man behind bars, Luciano remained surprisingly connected to the outside world. Meanwhile, the United States was shifting. The late 1930s brought the end of the Great Depression and the looming threat of global war. By 1941, America found itself drawn into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war transformed the nation, and unexpectedly, it would also transform Luciano's fate. During the early years of the war, U.S. military intelligence grew increasingly concerned about the security of New York Harbor. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied ships with alarming success. Rumors spread of German spies and saboteurs infiltrating the docks, threatening supply lines critical to the war effort. The docks were a lifeline for America's military machine, and protecting them became a top priority. But the docks of New York were not controlled by the government. They were controlled by organized crime. Longshoremen's unions, shipping companies, and waterfront rackets were under Mafia influence. Strikes, slowdowns, and sabotage were risks the military could not ignore. The government needed a solution, and in a twist of fate, the solution involved Lucky Luciano. Naval intelligence, searching for a way to secure the docks, turned to Meyer Lansky, Luciano's old friend and financial genius. Lansky had maintained his underworld connections while cultivating a reputation for patriotism. He despised fascism and Hitler, especially as a Jew with family in Europe. Approached by government officials, Lansky proposed an unusual arrangement. If the government wanted control of the docks, they needed Luciano's cooperation. It was an astonishing proposition. The United States Navy, in the middle of a world war, sought the help of a convicted gangster serving a decades-long prison sentence. But pragmatism often trumps morality in times of crisis, and the deal moved forward. In 1942, through intermediaries, Luciano agreed to assist. From his prison cell, Luciano authorized Lansky and other associates to use his name and influence to ensure cooperation on the waterfront. Strikes ended, sabotage fears diminished, and union leaders fell in line. Luciano's authority reached where government orders could not. The Mafia delivered stability, and the Navy gained security. Though details of the arrangement remain partly shrouded in secrecy, the consensus is clear: Luciano played a role in protecting America's docks during the war. The arrangement extended further. When the Allies planned the invasion of Sicily in 1943, naval intelligence once again turned to Luciano. His connections to Sicilian Mafia families provided valuable intelligence about the island's terrain, defenses, and political climate. Whether his contribution was decisive is debated, but it symbolized the extraordinary lengths to which the U.S. government was willing to go. For Luciano, it was more than cooperation, it was an opportunity for redemption. Meanwhile, in prison, Luciano's life shifted. Word of his cooperation with the government began to circulate quietly, raising his profile once again. Guards treated him with more respect, fellow inmates sought his favor, and rumors of early release began to swirl. Luciano himself remained pragmatic. He knew that nothing was guaranteed, but he also understood that the war gave him leverage he could never have imagined when he first entered prison. As the war drew to a close in 1945, pressure mounted to recognize Luciano's contributions. Naval officers and political figures lobbied for clemency, arguing that his assistance had aided the war effort. Governor Thomas E. Dewey, the very man who had prosecuted Luciano nearly a decade earlier, now faced the irony of considering his release. Dewey, cautious but pragmatic, weighed the decision carefully. For Luciano, the irony was not lost. The prosecutor, who had built his career by sending him to prison now, held the key to his freedom. But Lucky's life had always been defined by paradoxes: betrayer and visionary, gangster and patriot, prisoner and power broker. In 1945, the stage was set for the next twist in his remarkable story. Though still confined, Luciano had once again demonstrated his resilience. From behind bars, he had influenced the Mafia, aided the government, and secured a chance at freedom. His prison years had not broken him. They had, in some ways, elevated him to legend. He was no longer just the boss of the underworld. He was a man whose reach extended into the highest matters of national security. In the closing months of the war, as Allied victory seemed certain, the question loomed: what would become of Lucky Luciano? Would he remain a prisoner until death, or would the government's debt to him open the gates to freedom? Whatever the answer, one truth was undeniable: Luciano had once again proven that luck was only part of his story. His survival rested on adaptability, vision, and the ability to turn even disaster into opportunity. In January 1946, the gates of Clinton Correctional Facility opened, and Charles, Lucky Luciano, walked free after nearly a decade behind bars. His release was not the result of a legal appeal or a miraculous reversal of fortune, but of politics and pragmatism. His wartime cooperation with U.S. naval intelligence, helping to secure New York's docks and providing contacts in Sicily during the Allied invasion, had earned him clemency. Governor Thomas E. Dewey, the very man who had sent him to prison, signed the order reducing his sentence. Dewey claimed the decision was based solely on Luciano's contributions to national security. But Luciano's freedom came with a price: deportation. Within days of his release, federal agents placed him on a ship bound for Italy. For the first time in his life since boyhood, Lucky Luciano returned to his homeland, not as a conqueror, but as an exile. The journey back to Italy was bittersweet. On one hand, Luciano was a free man, no longer locked behind steel bars. On the other, he was stripped of his empire, cut off from the city that had defined his rise. America had been his kingdom, the streets of New York his battlefield, and the Commission his throne. Now he was cast out, sent to a country he barely knew. When Luciano arrived in Naples, Italian officials greeted him not as a hero, but as a problem. To them, he was an infamous gangster, an unwanted import from America. They placed him under police surveillance, restricting his movements and monitoring his associates. Yet for all their efforts, they could not control him entirely. Luciano's name carried weight, and his reputation opened doors even in exile. Italy in the late 1940s was a nation in turmoil. The war had left it devastated, its government weak, its economy shattered. Black markets thrived, and organized crime filled the vacuum left by failed institutions. The Sicilian Mafia, though battered by Mussolini's pro-war crackdowns, had re-emerged with renewed strength after the Allied invasion. Luciano, with his connections and experience, was in a unique position to influence this shifting landscape. At first, he kept a low profile. Settling in Naples, he lived in modest apartments, trying to adjust to life as an exile. But Luciano was not a man who could remain idle. Slowly, he began building contacts, re-establishing ties with Sicilian Mafia leaders, and cultivating relationships with black market operators. Cigarette smuggling became one of his early ventures, a lucrative trade in post-war Europe where American goods were in high demand. Though never proven to be its mastermind, Luciano's fingerprints were rumored to be all over the smuggling networks that linked Naples, Sicily, and North Africa. Despite his efforts, Luciano's life in Italy was far from glamorous. Police harassment was constant. Italian authorities, under pressure from the United States, raided his homes, tapped his phones, and shadowed his movements. Newspapers followed his every step, portraying him as a symbol of organized crime's international reach. For a man accustomed to operating from the shadows, the attention was both stifling and frustrating. Yet Luciano's influence could not be erased. From afar, he attempted to maintain contact with his old allies in America. Frank Costello now served as acting boss of Luciano's family, steering it toward gambling and politics rather than violence. Vito Genovese, having returned from Italy after wartime exile, was maneuvering to reclaim power. Luciano, though physically absent, still carried moral authority. His name was invoked in disputes, his opinion sought in decisions, and his blessing valued in underworld affairs. Even in exile, he remained the symbolic head of the organization he had created. But his absence from America also created vulnerabilities. Without direct control, factions within the commission grew bolder. Genovese, ambitious and ruthless, saw an opportunity to challenge Costello's dominance. The seeds of a future power struggle were being planted, and Luciano could do little more than watch from across the ocean. In Sicily, Luciano's presence unsettled more than just the police. The Mafia there, though tied by tradition to the American families, viewed him with suspicion. He was an outsider, raised in New York, speaking Italian with an American accent. Some saw him as a bridge between the old world and the new, a man who could connect Sicilian clans to the wealth of American organized crime. Others viewed him as an intruder, a figure who might overshadow local bosses. Luciano navigated this delicate balance with his usual pragmatism, forging alliances where he could while avoiding direct confrontation. Despite surveillance and restrictions, Luciano continued to dream of returning to America. He missed the energy of New York, the thrill of the nightclubs, the sense of command he once enjoyed. In exile, he was a man displaced, powerful yet constrained, respected yet hounded. His wealth allowed him comfort, but not satisfaction. He was a king without a kingdom. The late 1940s also brought him moments of personal reckoning. Luciano, once the charismatic playboy of Broadway, was aging. The years in prison and the stress of exile had worn on him. He remained a figure of charm and dignity, but the vitality of his youth was fading. Friends recalled a man reflective at times, even melancholy. He spoke often of America, of the streets where he had grown up, of the empire he had built and lost. Yet even in exile, his life was not devoid of drama. In 1947, rumors spread that Luciano was involved in heroin trafficking, using Sicily as a base for the burgeoning narcotics trade. The allegations were never fully proven, but they fueled the legend of Luciano as a global crime figure. American authorities pointed to him as the architect of international drug smuggling, while Luciano himself denied involvement. Whether guilty or not, the accusations reinforced the image of a man whose shadow stretched far beyond the confines of his exile. By 1950, Luciano had spent 4 years in Italy, a free man in theory, but a prisoner of circumstance in reality. His clemency had freed him from prison walls, but deportation had shackled him to a land he no longer called home. Still he endured, as he always had. Adaptability was his greatest talent, and in exile he adapted once more. The Sicilian years marked a new phase in Lucky Luciano's life. Less about direct command, more about influence, reputation, and survival. He had outlived rivals, wars, and prison sentences. Now, in the twilight of his career, he remained a symbol of the Mafia's enduring reach. Even in exile, his name carried power, whispered in the corridors of both New York's underworld and Sicily's countryside. Luciano's story was far from over. The coming decade would see him drawn once again into the orbit of American organized crime, not through direct action, but through alliances, betrayals, and the relentless pull of the life he had built. For now, though, in the streets of Naples and the hills of Sicily, Lucky Luciano lived as a paradox, exiled yet influential, defeated yet undefeated, a man whose destiny seemed always to bend toward survival. By the dawn of the 1950s, Charles Lucky Luciano was living in exile in Italy, still powerful in name, but increasingly restless in reality. His days were spent in Naples, shadowed by police, haunted by surveillance, and suffocated by the distance from New York, the city where his empire had been built. Yet Luciano had never been a man to accept irrelevance. If exile had cut him off from the streets of America, he would find other ways to exert his influence. It was during this period that Luciano orchestrated one of the most legendary gatherings in Mafia history, the Havana Conference. The road to Havana began with Luciano's desire to reassert control. Though deported, he maintained contact with his old associates in the United States. Frank Costello, still acting as the prime minister of the family, steered operations toward gambling and political influence, while Vito Genovese lurked in the background, plotting his eventual return to power. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky, Luciano's lifelong friend and ally, had his eyes on Cuba. Cuba, with its casinos, nightclubs, and proximity to the United States, was a paradise for organized crime. Corruption ran deep, and with dictator Fulgencio Batista welcoming American investment, Havana became the ideal hub for gambling and money laundering. Lansky envisioned Cuba as the Mafia's playground, a place where their operations could thrive beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. To make it happen, he needed Luciano's blessing, and Luciano, hungry for relevance, was eager to give it. In December 1946, Luciano secretly traveled from Italy to Havana, defying his deportation terms. The journey itself was a testament to his enduring clout. With forged documents and discreet arrangements, he slipped through Europe, across the Atlantic, and into Cuba. For the first time since his exile, he was reunited with many of his American associates. The Havana Conference that followed became a milestone in Mafia history. The gathering brought together some of the most powerful mobsters of the era: Lansky, Costello, Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and others. In the luxurious Hotel National, they discussed the future of organized crime. Topics included gambling in Cuba, narcotics trafficking, and the balance of power in New York. Luciano presided over the conference like a chairman of the board, reminding everyone of his role as the architect of the commission. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Lucky had reclaimed his throne. But beneath the glamour, tension simmered. Narcotics were a major point of contention. Luciano, though accused of drug involvement, insisted that large-scale heroin trafficking was too risky and would draw unwanted government attention. Others, particularly younger mobsters, saw narcotics as the future, an industry too profitable to ignore. Luciano's cautious stance clashed with the ambitions of men like Genovese, who advocated expanding into drugs. The debate foreshadowed the battles that would define the Mafia in the decades ahead. The Havana Conference also revealed the shifting balance of power. Luciano may have chaired the meeting, but he was no longer the undisputed boss. His exile had weakened him, and rivals like Genovese sensed vulnerability. Even his allies, like Costello and Lansky, knew that while Luciano's reputation commanded respect, his physical absence from the United States limited his control. The U.S. government soon caught wind of his presence in Havana. Newspapers published stories of Luciano's return to the Western Hemisphere, sparking outrage. American officials pressured the Cuban government to expel him, warning that his presence endangered diplomatic relations. Within months, Luciano was arrested by Cuban authorities and deported back to Italy. His brief resurgence had ended as abruptly as it began. Back in Naples, Luciano faced an increasingly hostile environment. Italian police intensified surveillance, raiding his apartments, searching his belongings, and disrupting his activities. American authorities accused him of masterminding international narcotics networks, using Sicily as a gateway to funnel heroin into the United States. Though evidence was often circumstantial, the allegations stuck. In the eyes of the press and law enforcement, Luciano had become the face of the global drug trade. Luciano, for his part, denied involvement. He argued that narcotics were dangerous and bad for business, claiming he had ordered his men to stay away from heroin. Whether this was true or an attempt to distance himself from scandal remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that by the early 1950s, heroin was flooding American streets, much of it traced back to routes through Sicily and Marseille. Whether Luciano was directing it or merely powerless to stop it, his name was forever linked to the trade. As the decade wore on, Luciano's health began to falter. Years of stress, prison, and exile took their toll. Though still sharp and commanding in conversation, he suffered from heart problems and bouts of depression. His once active social life narrowed to small circles of loyal friends and occasional visits from allies. In Naples, he was both watched and isolated, a man who had once ruled empires now reduced to fighting rumors and fending off police raids. Yet even in decline, Luciano remained a legend. To young mobsters, his name carried an aura of authority. To the press, he was the archetype of the international crime boss. To law enforcement, he was the elusive mastermind they could never fully pin down. And to himself, he was still the man who had built the commission, reshaped the Mafia, and survived wars, betrayals, and prison. The 1950s also saw the erosion of Luciano's American legacy. Vito Genovese, having returned from Italy, finally moved to seize power. In 1957, he orchestrated the assassination of Albert Anastasia, boss of the feared Murder, Inc., and then convened the Appalachian meeting in upstate New York, a gathering of mob leaders that ended in disaster when police raided the event. Genovese's ambition destabilized the underworld, and though Luciano watched from afar, he could do little to influence events. His absence was now undeniable. The empire he had built lived on, but it was slipping from his grasp. By the mid-1950s, Luciano's life had become a paradox. He was famous but powerless, feared but constantly harassed, alive but increasingly frail. His time in Havana had been his last great act on the international stage, a fleeting moment when he reminded the world of who he was. Since then, his story had been one of decline, and yet even in waning power, he remained Lucky Luciano. He had survived the street wars of New York, outlasted rivals like Masseria and Maranzano, escaped death countless times, and even turned prison into an opportunity for redemption. Now, as his health weakened and his influence faded, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined his rise. He was not just another gangster lost to time. He was the man who had changed the very structure of organized crime. The twilight of Luciano's life was approaching. The stage was set for his final years, years that would see him still haunted by narcotics allegations, still yearning for relevance, and ultimately facing death in exile. But in the mid-1950s, as the world of organized crime shifted around him, Lucky Luciano remained what he had always been: a survivor, a strategist, and a legend whose name would never be forgotten. By the late 1950s, Charles Lucky, Luciano was no longer the commanding figure of his prime. The Havana Conference had been his last major attempt to reassert control over the international underworld, but his deportation back to Italy and the relentless accusations of drug trafficking had diminished his power. Still, he remained a legend, his name invoked by both allies and enemies, lawmen and journalists, as the embodiment of the modern mafia. But behind the legend, Luciano was a man aging in exile, struggling with fading health, constant surveillance, and the unshakable burden of his past. Naples became both his refuge and his prison. By now, the Italian authorities had made it routine to raid his apartments, search his belongings, and question his visitors. The American press frequently labeled him the kingpin of the international heroin trade, a charge Luciano denied repeatedly. He insisted he wanted no part in narcotics, dismissing them as reckless and dangerous. Yet suspicion clung to him, in part because the drug trade in post-war Europe was flourishing, and Sicily had become a crucial link in the heroin pipeline to the United States. Whether Luciano orchestrated it or was merely an easy scapegoat, his name became inseparable from the narrative. These years revealed a quieter, more reflective side of Lucky. Gone were the flashy Broadway nights, the glamorous clubs, and the sense of invulnerability he once projected. In their place was a man forced to confront his mortality. He was in his 60s now, worn down by years of stress, prison, and exile. Friends recalled a figure who, while still charming and articulate, had grown more pensive. He often reminisced about New York, the Lower East Side streets of his youth, the speakeasies of Prohibition, the commission he had built. America, though it had cast him out, remained the love of his life, the backdrop of his triumphs and betrayals. Despite his exile, Luciano was not without company. He maintained close ties with old allies such as Meyer Lansky, who occasionally visited Europe, and a small circle of loyal companions who ensured he was never truly alone. Women still found their way into his life, though his health limited the playboy lifestyle he once enjoyed. To those who met him in these years, he remained magnetic, polite, sharp, and quick to tell a story. But the police never let him forget who he was. Italian authorities, under constant pressure from the United States, raided his home again in 1952, arresting him briefly on narcotics charges. Though the case collapsed for lack of evidence, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. Luciano complained bitterly about the harassment, calling himself a political prisoner without bars. He believed the Americans would never forgive him for outsmarting them, for creating a system of organized crime that even law enforcement could not dismantle. Meanwhile, events in the United States confirmed his declining influence. Vito Genovese finally made his move, seizing power in New York and forcing Frank Costello into retirement after a botched assassination attempt in 1957. That same year, the infamous Appalachian meeting in upstate New York exposed the Mafia to public scrutiny like never before. Dozens of mob bosses were caught fleeing the raid, and suddenly the government could no longer deny the existence of a national crime syndicate. Luciano, thousands of miles away, could only watch as the empire he had built transformed into something even larger and more dangerous than he had imagined. By the early 1960s, Luciano's health was failing. Years of heart problems left him weakened, and though he tried to maintain an active routine, he was increasingly aware that his time was running out. It was during this period that an unexpected opportunity arose, the chance to tell his story. Hollywood producers and journalists sought him out, eager to capture the tale of the man who had invented the modern mafia. For Luciano, the idea was appealing. He wanted to shape his own legacy, to present himself not as a villain, but as a strategist, a man who had brought order to chaos. In early 1962, Luciano agreed to cooperate with an Italian-American producer on a biographical film about his life. He gave interviews, discussed details of his rise and fall, and spoke candidly about his vision for organized crime. For him, it was a final attempt to define himself, to leave behind more than rumors and police files. He wanted the world to understand that he was not just another gangster, but a man who had reshaped an entire underworld. But fate intervened. On January 26, 1962, Luciano was scheduled to meet with the film producer at Naples Capodichino Airport. The two men greeted each other warmly, discussing the project with excitement. As they walked toward a waiting car, Luciano suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. A massive heart attack struck him down instantly. Within minutes, Charles Lucky Luciano, the boy from the Lower East Side who had risen to command the Mafia, was dead at the age of 64. His death sent ripples across the world. In Italy, police officials seemed almost relieved, declaring an end to years of surveillance. In America, newspapers ran bold headlines recounting his long career of crime, power, and exile. Some painted him as the ultimate villain, the architect of narcotics trafficking. Others acknowledged him as a criminal genius, the man who had transformed the Mafia into a modern corporation. Among mobsters, his passing marked the end of an era. Luciano's funeral in Naples drew a crowd of mourners, but it was in America that his true legacy lingered. After much debate, U.S. authorities allowed his body to be transported to New York, fulfilling his lifelong wish to return. Thousands attended his funeral procession through the streets of the city he had loved and ruled. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, not far from the graves of other legendary Mafia figures. It was a final, ironic victory. Deported in life, Luciano came home in death. The legacy he left behind was complex. To law enforcement, he remained a criminal mastermind who had outsmarted the system and profited from vice, violence, and corruption. To historians, he was the pivotal figure who modernized organized crime, turning it from a collection of warring gangs into a disciplined syndicate. To his associates, he was both mentor and myth, a man whose vision of the Commission endured long after his passing. Even today, Lucky Luciano's name resonates as a symbol of the Mafia's golden age. He embodied both the brutality and the sophistication of organized crime, a man who played the long game and survived where others perished. He had lived by strategy, by alliances, by pragmatism, and by luck, always luck. In the end, his death was natural, not violent, a rarity in the world he inhabited. The story of Lucky Luciano closed not with a bullet, but with a heartbeat, not in a dark alley, but in the open air of an airport. It was a fitting end for a man whose life had been a paradox. Criminal yet visionary, ruthless yet calculating, feared yet respected. His empire had long since slipped from his hands, but his blueprint for organized crime would shape the underworld for decades to come. And so, in January 1962, the curtain fell on one of history's most notorious and fascinating figures. Charles Lucky Luciano left behind not just a legend, but a structure, a system, and a story that would forever define the intersection of crime, power, and survival. His life had been a gamble from the start, and true to his name, he had remained lucky until the very end. When Charles Lucky Luciano collapsed and died at Naples Capodichino Airport in January 1962, many believed the story of his life had ended there. In truth, it was only the beginning of his legend. Luciano had not simply been a mob boss. He had been an architect. He created a structure, the Commission, that would outlive him. He reshaped the Mafia from a loose collection of feuding gangs into a disciplined syndicate that could endure the loss of any one leader. His death closed a chapter, but the system he designed continued to evolve, adapt, and spread across the globe. In the years immediately following Luciano's passing, the American Mafia entered a turbulent era. The 1960s saw the rise of Vito Genovese as the most powerful boss in New York, only for him to be imprisoned after a 1959 narcotics conviction. The commission, which Luciano had envisioned as a council of equals, began to fracture under the weight of ambition and greed. Still, the structure held. Families continued to meet, disputes were mediated, and the Mafia's code of discipline remained intact. Luciano's vision, an underworld governed like a corporation, proved resilient. But with resilience came evolution. The very thing Luciano had tried to avoid, massive involvement in narcotics, became the Mafia's most lucrative business. By the late 1960s and 1970s, heroin smuggling dominated organized crime, much of it traced to the infamous French connection. The routes Luciano was accused of overseeing in the 1940s and 1950s now became fully operational, linking Sicilian traffickers, Corsican refiners, and American distributors. Whether he intended it or not, his model provided the foundation for the global drug trade. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the Mafia underwent its own transformation. Post-war poverty, political instability, and the booming heroin market turned Cosa Nostra into a powerful force, not just in villages but in cities and even government institutions. The Sicilian bosses studied Luciano's model of coordination and hierarchy, adopting similar councils to settle disputes. For decades, Italian prosecutors would trace the organizational DNA of the Sicilian Mafia back to Luciano's innovations in America. By the 1980s, however, both the American and Sicilian mafias faced unprecedented pressure. In the United States, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, Araixu, gave prosecutors new tools to dismantle the mafia's leadership. Major trials, such as the 1986 Commission case, sent entire generations of bosses to prison. In Sicily, the maxi trials of the late 1980s and early 1990s, led by judges Giovanni Falcon and Paolo Borsellino, exposed the depth of Cosa Nostra's power. Both judges were assassinated in brutal bombings, but their legacy crippled the Sicilian Mafia. Yet even as law enforcement struck blows, Luciano's system endured. The commission in New York may have weakened, but families adapted, going underground, diversifying into construction, waste management, loan sharking, and international smuggling. In Italy, the Sicilian Mafia ceded ground to new groups like the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta, which built global cocaine networks reaching as far as South America and Australia. All of these organizations, however, operated with the same principles Luciano had once championed: hierarchy, secrecy, cooperation, and diversification. Beyond the Mafia, Luciano's influence seeped into other criminal organizations worldwide. The Mexican cartels, rising in the 1980s and 1990s, adopted corporate-style structures, mirroring the commission model to coordinate smuggling routes. Russian organized crime, exploding after the collapse of the Soviet Union, built networks that echoed Luciano's emphasis on alliances and shared profit. Even Asian tribes and African criminal syndicates began to operate less like street gangs and more like transnational corporations. Luciano had shown the underworld a blueprint for survival in the modern age, and others followed it. By the turn of the 21st century, organized crime had become a globalized industry, stretching across continents, using technology and infiltrating legitimate economies. Cybercrime, human trafficking, arms smuggling, and international money laundering became as important as narcotics and gambling. Yet beneath these modern crimes lay the same DNA Luciano had instilled: collaboration over chaos, business over bloodshed, and governance through councils rather than constant war. Even governments acknowledged Luciano's role in shaping the modern underworld. Declassified documents from World War II revealed the extent of his cooperation with U.S. naval intelligence, fueling debates about whether he was a patriot, a pragmatist, or simply a man who used war to buy freedom. Historians argued about his role in narcotics, with some insisting he masterminded international heroin smuggling, while others portrayed him as reluctant to embrace drugs. But on one point there was little dispute: Luciano had permanently changed the mafia's structure, and by extension, the face of organized crime worldwide. As decades passed, Lucky Luciano became more than a historical figure. He became a cultural icon. Books, films, and television shows drew inspiration from his life. Hollywood portrayed him as both villain and visionary, a criminal mastermind with the discipline of a businessman. Documentaries dissected his decisions, from eliminating Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano to creating the Commission. Popular culture elevated him into the pantheon of underworld legends, alongside names like Al Capone and John Gotti. Yet unlike Capone, whose empire crumbled quickly, Luciano's legacy endured in the institutions he built. From 1962 to 2025, the world of organized crime evolved dramatically, but Luciano's fingerprints never faded. The Mafia itself declined in overt power by the 21st century, weakened by law enforcement, defections, and cultural shifts. Yet it adapted, focusing more on financial crimes, international smuggling, and infiltration of legitimate businesses. In Italy, the 'Ndrangheta rose to dominate global cocaine trade, while Cosa Nostra maintained influence in construction and politics. In America, the five families still existed, smaller, quieter, but still operating in the shadows. Luciano's commission, though battered, remained a guiding principle. Globally, the rise of cartels, syndicates, and networks all reflected Luciano's legacy. The drug empires of Pablo Escobar and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman mirrored his approach to alliances, discipline, and ruthless pragmatism. Cyber-criminal organizations in Russia and Eastern Europe adopted hierarchies and revenue-sharing systems similar to the mafias. Even terrorist groups borrowed from Luciano's playbook, using business-like structures to sustain themselves. By 2025, Lucky Luciano's life remained a touchstone for understanding organized crime. Scholars continued to debate his motives. Was he a reluctant exile dreaming of America, or a calculating mastermind pulling strings until the end? Was he truly against narcotics, or merely clever enough to deny involvement? Did his wartime cooperation redeem him in part, or was it just another survival tactic? These questions lingered, adding to the myth. What is certain is that Luciano's story cannot be confined to the years he lived. His death in 1962 closed one life, but his system lived on, replicated, and adapted across the globe for generations. He proved that crime could be organized like a corporation, that power could be shared through councils rather than endless wars, and that survival required pragmatism above all. Charles Lucky Luciano began as a poor immigrant kid fighting on the streets of the Lower East Side. He rose through violence, betrayal, and strategy to become the father of modern organized crime. And even 6 decades after his death, in a world of cartels, syndicates, and cybercriminals, his influence remains visible. He was, above all else, a survivor and an innovator. His luck may have ended in Naples in 1962, but his blueprint continues to shape the underworld of 2025. Luciano's life was a gamble from start to finish. And like every great gambler, he left behind not just winnings or losses, but a system for others to follow. That is why his name endures, not as a relic of the past, but as the foundation of organized crime's future.